My name is Steve Coe. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Community Access. And my assignment, I have about 15 minutes to draw a line between the history of our organization, what we're about, how our philosophy towards treating people with mental illness has evolved and brought us to a point today where we're talking about engaging youth in hopefully changing the world for a better place. And we have some exciting speakers. We have colleagues have come in from Canada to talk about what I think is an extremely compelling opportunity for New York to engage young people in high school around this issue. So, why us, why now, and what's next? So just my role here is to do a little slideshow and explain sort of our history and how we got to where we are today. But I wanted to, as part of this presentation, just to reflect that mental health care has come a long way, and we think we still have a long way to go. But this picture of Manhattan Psychiatric Center really represents what the state of the art for 100 years represented mental health care. And at one point, that hospital on Ward's Island, Manhattan Psychiatric Center, had about 4,000 patients. It's got about 400 or 200 people now, maybe 400. And the building's still there. A lot of the staff are still there. There was 28 of these buildings around the state. So it's been very hard to close the actual buildings, but the patients are no longer inside them. And our founders were connected to that hospital. Our founder, Fred Hartman's sister, was a patient there. And he saw what her life was like in the hospital and what her life was like living in very squalid housing when she was discharged in the 1970s. And put together a group and started buying and renting apartments, and eventually wound up buying 2 tenement buildings in the Lower East Side and had 44 apartments with families living there, and also ex-patients who had been formerly homeless, and some had been incarcerated. I came along as a graduate student about that time. That's me actually standing in front of the building in 1979. And I was taken by the model that you could provide housing for people and do it in a way that people living there were supporting themselves. They had leases, they were paying rent. The Lower East Side in the 1970s looked pretty much like this. We were the last building standing on the block. These were tenement buildings, so you had your bathtub in the kitchen. But what was great was that people had their own home, and they had each other, and there was a community room, and they paid rent, and there were families and children living in the building with them. We had an opportunity then to start. Those buildings were torn down for an urban renewal project, but we retained the same philosophy. I said, when we're going to build housing, we're going to basically replace what was there in the core of that building. So our first project in 1993, our new construction, actually has 50 units. 28 are families, and 22 are people that graduated from our transitional housing program. Next, we took over an old hospital down on the Lower East Side, which had been abandoned, and converted into what we now call Gouverneur Court, a mix of units for people both with a history of mental illness. And we brought forward the idea that if we're going to do housing, we're going to do it well and make it an attractive place for people to be. They'll take pride in where they live, and it instills this sense that you belong in the community, and we're going to be good neighbors, and we're going to be able to represent when we go forward in the future that when we do housing, that people will welcome us into the community. So as funding became available for additional development, we went to Brooklyn and we built a building on Calb Avenue, opened in 2004. This is in the Bronx a couple of years later, again in the Bronx another year later. All of these buildings have families and children in them. So I think we figured out the model for the housing. So our next goal was how to stop this stream of people coming into our programs who are getting damaged by the treatment they're getting. And a lot of that damage takes place in hospital settings where people are confined. They lose their rights. They can't see their friends. They're over-medicated. And so we've been trying for 20 years to figure out an alternative to hospital care. And with the support of the city and a woman named Trish Marsick, who's sitting right over here, we were able to come forward and actually develop a model and get funding from the federal government for a program called the Respite Center. And it was a 3-year pilot that we have now been able to roll into ongoing funding from the city and the state. So instead of a patient, you're a guest. You can stay for an average of 5 or 6 days. We have 8 private rooms. All the staff that work there are people who have lived experience themselves, which is part of the nature of our program, which I'll talk about in a second. But it is representing now an alternative pathway for people from going into hospitals. So you're staying out of the hospital, you're living in our housing, but people still are not as well as they should be. So we've built in health and programs into the agency. And for us, health means a lot of things. It can mean getting on a bicycle. So we started a bike share program we call Access-a-Cycle. People hadn't been on a bike in 30 years, and they're riding now. We have our 3rd bike trip to Governor's Island is coming up later next month. City Bike actually lets us take bikes as a group, so we can get a lot of people on bikes in addition to the bikes that we've purchased. We started an urban farming program. We have an urban farmer on staff, and we have these planting beds all over the agency now. In the late 90s, we started a pet access, so we encourage people to adopt pets. When you have a building with 100 or 200 tenants in it, and everybody's going outside with their dogs, it changes the culture of the building. Instead of people with special needs, you have pet owners. My operations people resisted this for a while, but it has been one of the best things that we've ever done. The other thing we did, we made a very conscious decision in 1992 to change the culture of our workforce, and by that to also change the nature of our work. So we made a decision to affirmatively hire people who had been in the mental health system to work here. And through that actually created a learning center called the Howie the Harp Peer Advocacy Center, named after a fellow named Howard Geld, who played a harmonica. He got the handle Howie the Harp, and was the inspiration for this, and one of the first people I hired as part of our cultural transformation of our own program. Howie died 2 weeks before the training program started in 1995, and we've named the program after him. We have graduated about 1,200 people over the last 20 years who are working in jobs all over the city in all kinds of settings. This is a job fair, so after almost 20 weeks of training, the students get an opportunity to interview for internships, and we have employers coming in. About 60 different employers come in and interview people. There's also a large graduation ceremony. We do it this at NYU. Friends, family, colleagues come and celebrate the success people have. We're also part of the Mayor's Thrive NYC program. They've contracted with us to train additional peers, so we trained the first 80 people starting in January this year through June. Sort of a condensed version of Howie the Harp, but it contains many of the same elements. Finally, we believe in social justice and social change, and part of as we're talking about connecting with youth, that is exactly where this falls. In this room about a month ago, we had a meeting with the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board. We were very involved in the criminal justice and the way the police and the courts treat people with mental illness. We spearheaded a campaign to train police officers in crisis intervention training. About 3,000 officers have been trained so far. We're advocating for 15,000 officers to be trained, which would be about 40% of the force. We sponsored a community forum last year. The woman in the cap on the right is Carla Rabinowitz. She's our advocacy coordinator. The next series of slides are really the Carla Rabinowitz show. There's Carla at the mic. After Deborah Danner was shot by the police last fall, we held a speak out in front of City Hall. So even though officers are getting trained, the right officers are not showing up when 911 is called. And we're working on alternatives for that response. It should not be the police necessarily who are coming in the first instance. We're also housing advocates, so we've had many efforts to expand housing. This was at the front of the governor's office last year. We finally got the governor to support a 6,000 unit investment in supportive housing. So it's 1,500 units a year coming online. I didn't mention, so we have about 1,100 units currently in operation, and we have about 900 units in our pipeline. So we're really taking advantage of both the city and the state's housing initiatives as we go forward. Finally, fighting stigma and having the general public think differently about this in a way that what we're doing is sort of invisible when we build housing and the people who live there. So we wanted to figure out a way to go public. And this was actually one of Carla's inspirations to start a film festival focused on mental health issues, and we launched it in 2005. A couple of years ago, we moved from Brooklyn to Manhattan and got a lot more coverage, so it's really expanded. And the woman at the mic there looks familiar. Hello. And this was last year. We had a famous woman basketball player, Shamika Holtzclaw, was featured, and her story of recovery was very inspiring. And also last year, we started a new program, and this is where we got our inspiration for engaging youth in our mission and our advocacy efforts. And so our second young filmmaker competition is this year, and later this afternoon we're going to be showing one of the entries. I came across this little quote that young people should be at the forefront of global change and innovation. Empowered, they can be keys for development and peace. Let us ensure that young people have every opportunity to participate fully in the lives of their societies. And I think if we don't do that, we're going to, not move past the past. And even now, as there are homeless people with clearly in need of help on the street, there's a lot of people calling for the reopening of institutions, that we've closed too many hospitals, there's not enough beds in the hospitals. And our vision is much different than this. Our vision is that the system has failed because we haven't created the right alternatives for people, and that if we create those alternatives, that we will never have to go back to institutional care and confinement. It's my distinct pleasure now to introduce Maynard Alas, who came to Community Access as a teenager and went through our program and is now an employee as a peer respite worker in the Respite Center. So Maynard, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you everyone for coming. Just want to say how great it is that we're having this conversation now. At this age, this is really make or break time for us, young adults. We have to live and learn and hopefully not get misdiagnosed like I did a couple times. Yeah. I need to pay my bills. I need to get a job to pay those bills. Will I be happy with this job? What's the point of getting a job if I'm not happy? What's the point of anything if I'm not happy? What's the point of anything, period? That was me at 10 years old, sitting in a classroom biting my nails down until they bled. And that was me at 19 years old when I experienced my first break. High school was particularly rough period for me. The emphasis on going to college and adulthood validated my anxieties, and by the time I graduated, I had become a ball of stress, anger, and self-loathing. I had a therapist and was prescribed medication, but by this point I was convinced I wasn't even worth the effort to get the help. I was able to tolerate one semester of college before I began to break down, and a few months later I was ready to end my suffering. Fortunately, there was a concert that I really wanted to go to, so I reached out to my therapist for help and was able to, go somewhere safe. I spent the next 3 months at Bellevue Hospital in a psych ward and discharged with the agreement that I would get ongoing care at a day program with some agency I had never heard of called Community Access. I was going to give the program, East Village Access, about a week, and when I fell back into old habits, I was going to move forward with that plan I had 3 months ago. 1 week turned into 2 weeks, turned into 5 years of getting support, acceptance, and the understanding that I needed. I was able to thrive because I was allowed a safe space to make decisions and gain insight into myself by reflecting on those consequences. Decisions like overcoming my anxiety to apply to a playwriting program and ultimately win the thing and go on to share the stage with Gabrielle Sidibe, Rosie Perez, and Seth Green. Decisions like applying to work at Community Access. Today I'm a peer worker at the Manhattan Crisis Respite Center, providing the same support and understanding that was offered to me. If that same 10-year-old nail-biting boy could see into the future, he'd rest easy knowing he can pay those bills, be happy, and find the purpose in life that he always wanted.
So Maynard, I asked you earlier about guests that are coming to the Respite Center, and you said you recently had a young person there.
Yeah, actually a 20-year-old we recently had, without going into too much detail. At 14, he had started doing heroin. 14 years old. And he spent the next 6 years traveling the country. He's from the West Coast, and he made it all the way over here in 6 years, and he's currently street homeless. So, he came to us at a respite center, just a whole lot of, in need of a lot of, emotional regulation, He's a kid who didn't have family growing up. He's a kid who just needed love, care, and attention. Just needed a friend, just needed to be outside of those circles where he was doing these things, and I feel like we were able to help him, but yeah, he needs more support. Right now he's at East Village Access, where I'm able to, I also work there part-time, so I'm able to provide that, but it's kids like this, it's these heartbreaking stories where you really need, we really need to look at and address, Okay. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So one of the things we're concerned about is the use of medication with kids, and there's the growing number of kids that are on disability. They're on SSI and are getting medicated. There's children getting medicated at 3 and 4 years old. And having, and catching these kids earlier and doing something different with them is really critical. 54% of young people on SSI are diagnosed with major depression, anxiety, bipolar disorders. And if we don't respond differently to these kids, they're going to become the future customers of Community Access, and we really don't want them. We want them to stay in school, keep their friends, get a career, and have a family, and too often that if that pathway gets broken, it's really hard to get back, and we've seen it again and again. And I think the Maynards story is very typical of the kinds of trauma that kids suffer, and that trauma is reflected in all kinds of then behaviors and losses that follow. So this is a message of great hope that we think we have found a way to engage kids, and we have a wonderful teenager you're going to meet later this afternoon. But the next part of this presentation is going to be the JED Foundation. And should we break now?
10 minutes.
Huh?
10 minutes.
Okay. So we have time for some questions or thoughts or reaction. Randy?
We actually need about a 5-minute break at least.
Okay. All right. Yes?
What would you encourage parents to say to a mental health professional, a doctor, who is trying to push a child that a parent might think does not require medical intervention or medicine therapeutically, when it seems that doctors, their prevailing inquest is almost always to prescribe. There is usually a backlash against parents when they say no. There's usually a guilt trip that follows that you're not doing what's best for your child.
I'm so totally unqualified to answer that question, but we have some, Randy. Go ahead. Introduce yourself first.
My name is Randy Silverman, and I am CEO of the Youth Mental Health Project. I myself am a parent, and I'll tell a little bit more about my story when I speak later on. But in general, you're right. I think what I advise parents, and I consult with a lot of parents, is to trust your instinct. At the same time, because no one knows your child the way you do. At the same time, we need to come together as a community and teach mental health practitioners and parents alike how to engage appropriately with each other. And there's a real problem, a huge gulf between mental health practitioners and between parents and families. And that's one of the things we work hard at the Youth Mental Health Project, is trying to bridge that gulf. What parents need to do is break beyond the blame and the shame and teach themselves as much as they can, learn as much as they can, educate themselves. There's no black and white answer. There's no magic pill. Medicine can be helpful, can be very helpful, but it also there are a lot of side effects and risks involved. A parent needs to know the entire, have a greater understanding of what a child's mental health means and what that's all about at various stages, in order to engage appropriately and sufficiently with a doctor. And sometimes I have found that when a parent goes to a doctor with knowledge, with research, saying, I know what I'm talking about and I know my child, the doctor does realize, wow, this parent's done some research and knows something, and let's have a respectful, meaningful engagement between us to help this child. And I would suggest, if you can't have that relationship with a mental health practitioner, find a new one, period. Just find a new one.
Thank you. Okay. So we're going to prepare for the next discussion. Okay. Good. Thank you all. Great.